Good day. When discussing wars and what happens after wars, there's a well known phrase, often used, I believe, by military historians, that while victory has many fathers, defeat is an orphan. And there has just been published in the Washington Post a simply colossal article in two parts, going over the story of Ukraine's failed counteroffensive, describing it in painstaking detail, and showing that, in fact, there are now people hard at work in Washington trying to shift the entire blame for the failure of the counteroffensive onto the Ukrainians. And, by the way, onto General Zaluzhny in particular. Well, I'm going to come to this article, which is interesting in some of the information it provides later in this program. But it's clear to me, and this article is just one example, that we are now very much into the territory of recriminations. In Ukraine, Zelensky and Zaluzhny are blaming each other for the fact that everything went wrong. So it's Zaluzhny apparently is telling people that the reason things didn't work out as planned was because of constant meddling and interference on the part of Zelensky's office. Zelensky, for his part, through his various officials and MPs in the Ukrainian parliament, is busy saying that General Zaluzhny doesn't have a proper plan for how the war is to be conducted. The Americans and the Ukrainians are busy blaming each other also. The Americans say that the Ukrainians didn't do all the things that were agreed, that the tactics weren't correct, that the plans that were drawn up on the eve of the offensive weren't followed. And the Ukrainians, for their part, are coming back and are saying that the American plans were disconnected to reality, and the weapons that Ukraine was given were nowhere near adequate for the tasks that the Ukrainians were asked to perform. I'm going to briefly give my own view, which is I'm going to elaborate on a little further in this program, though I want to stress that this is now a historic issue. The offensive, the summer offensive, having now failed. But for the record, I'm quite clear in my mind that the major blame for the failure of the offensive, or perhaps I should say more properly, for the decision to launch an offensive at all, an offensive which was all but certain to fail before it even began, well, the major blame for that lies in the United States, in Washington, in completely unrealistic and understandings of the nature of the war made by top officials within the Biden administration, and including, by the way, though he now is trying to distance himself from this debacle, the then chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley. But anyway, let's first, before we come to these interesting topics, let's look at what the situation is on the front lines, and then let's discuss further this extraordinary meeting that took place between General Zaluzhny and General Austin in Kiev, which was different from what I understood it to be when I did my program yesterday. So let's start, first of all, with the situation on the battlefronts. And here I have to say straight away that there has been a lack of news for the moment. There's been some reports that I've seen that Russian troops have now reduced in size the Ukrainian bridgehead in Krinky. I discussed extensively yesterday in my program yesterday the lengthy report that the BBC has published about this and the comments about this bridgehead provided by a Ukrainian soldier, showing what a disastrous and, it seems to me, misconceived operation that whole Krinky, Dnieper, Kherson operation actually is. But anyway, there were some reports yesterday that the Russians are now taking steps, finally, to shrink the bridgehead and to make it unviable. Well, we'll see whether or not that is correct. And there were quite a few reports yesterday, not always easy to track, however, that the Russians have made rapid advances towards Liman, in the Liman area, towards the Oskol River, that the Ukrainians have had to reassign troops from the Oskol River positions, and that this has enabled the Russians to make significant advances there of several kilometers, pushing hard towards the Oskol River and presumably ultimately towards Liman itself. So that's in the north. There's also reports that there's been bitter fighting for control of the village of Sinkovka, that the Russians are gradually, successfully consolidating control of Sinkovka, but that the Ukrainians are still fiercely defending their positions there. And there's also been reports, quite interesting reports, that the Russians have made further progress, though gradual progress, around Stepnoye and Berdichi, or in the Avdeyevka sector of the battlefronts. This is where the most bitter fighting in Avdeyevka is taking place between the Russian forces and Ukraine's by now surely exhausted 47th Mechanized Brigade, that the Russians have now succeeded in advancing to the north of Stepnoye and control part of that village, at least part of that village, and that it is starting to look as if Ukrainian positions there might be beginning to fold. We've had claims about Stepnoye before. This has clearly been an extremely tough encounter battle. But for what it's worth, those are the reports I've been seeing today. Most dramatic report I've seen over the course of the day, and one which was reported by the TASS news agency, which suggests that it is authoritative, however, related to the fighting around Bakhmut, but it is a report which I find extremely difficult to understand. And this is what it says. It says the following: units of the Expeditionary Volunteer Assault Corps have blocked off the last highway used to deliver supplies to Ukrainian forces near Artyomovsk, that's of course Bakhmut, and Soledar. The unit spokesman, Alexei Selivanov, has told TASS. The Corps' 4 columns reached the Artyomovsk-Chasov Yar road north of Artyomovsk. The columns of the North and Vostok V brigades, the Yenisei Cossack detachment and the Nevsky detachment cut the last supply road leading to the Ukrainian Bakhmut Solidar group. And then TASS goes on to say that Selivanov added that Ukrainian soldiers were using the Volga radio frequency to declare that they were ready to lay down arms. Barrier troops, minefields, and Ukrainian drones hovering over their positions impede surrender attempts. For fear of being hit by friendly fire, Ukrainian soldiers have to wait until nighttime to give up to Russian forces. Selivanov said control of the road opened a gateway to Kramatorsk. Now, All of this is extraordinary, but as I said, I don't fully understand what it means. I'm not sure what it means, actually. The last I heard was that Russian troops, paratroopers in fact, had captured the village of Khromovo, and that they'd managed to gain a significant amount of ground around Khromovo and were preparing an assault on Bogdanovka. And here we have, coming out of the blue, a report from a spokesman of a group of volunteer group forces. These are clearly units distinct and separate from the regular Russian military. They're claiming that they have presumably advanced beyond Bogdanovka and have cut the main road between Bogdanovka and Bakhmut. Artyomov, of course, is Bakhmut, and Chasov Yar. And that the Ukrainian troops in the area are now communicating through a radio frequency, through the Volga radio frequency, which is used by the Russians, has been opened by the Russians to enable Ukrainian troops who want to surrender to communicate the fact that that is what they want to do. Anyway, there's been this report that these Ukrainian troops, are now preparing to surrender. Well, all very interesting, but all very vague, and I would like to have a lot more information about what exactly is going on. And I do wonder, actually, whether perhaps Mr. Selivanov is reporting things ahead of events. But anyway, no doubt we will find out the whole situation before long and in due course. So that's that report from TASS. There's also been an interesting report from the British Defence Ministry, about whom I'm going to say an awful lot more shortly. But their very latest report deals with the situation in Marinka. And they say this: over recent weeks, Russian forces have made creeping advances through the ruins of Marinka, a town in Donetsk Oblast. Russia now likely controls most of the built-up area. However, Ukrainian forces remain in control of pockets of territory on the western edge of the town. Marinka has been on the front line since 2014 with a pre-war population of 9,000. It is comprehensively ruined. Drone footage suggests that the vast majority of buildings have been reduced to rubble. Russia's renewed efforts against Marinka are part of Russia's autumn offensive, which is prioritizing extending Russia's control over the remaining parts of the Donetsk Oblast, highly likely still one of the Kremlin's core war aims. Now, all of that is factually true. It is exactly what I've been reporting for several days on this channel. And of course, my reports are based on other reports that I've been reading on Russian Telegram channels and Ukrainian Telegram channels also, about the situation in Marinka. And we now have a factual report from the British Ministry of Defence telling us this. Note the careful language that Ukrainian Ukrainian troops in Marinka, they are still in control of only pockets of territory on the western edge of the town. So the British Ministry of Defence confirms that there have been Russian advances in Marinka and that the Russians are still aiming to gain control of the entirety of Donetsk Oblast, which remains one of their key war aims. Now, I see this report, which does not suggest that Russian efforts here are flagging, that the Russians will not be able to complete the capture of Marinka. I see this report as the British Ministry of Defence preparing the ground for an admission, presumably at some point over the next few days, that the Russians have finally secured complete control of Marinka. Notice also the observation that this town of 9,000 people has been reduced to rubble, something else, by the way, which is true, but which appears to have been inserted into this intelligence bulletin, Defense Ministry bulletin, in order to tell us that the capture of this place, Marinka, is not especially important. I suspect that is what the British Ministry of Defence is going to tell us when confirmation comes at some point in the next few days, or perhaps weeks, that Marinka has indeed finally and fully been secured by the Russians. Whilst I am on the topic of the British Ministry of Defence and its various bulletins, I notice that they have quietly revised down significantly their claims about Russian losses. Now, I did a program a few days ago in which I said that I did not understand why the media in the West and why British government officials and Western government officials were still floating fantastic claims about huge Russian losses in the hundreds of thousands, when we've had a careful study, rolling study by Mediazona, backed by the BBC, which puts those figures, gives us actual concrete figures for Russian losses, which are far below these inflated figures that we've been seeing mentioned by all sorts of people in the West, and which seem to ultimately derive from Ukrainian sources. Well, the British Ministry of Defence has now provided us with what it claims to be a breakdown of Russian losses. And what it's trying to do, from so far as I can see, is reconcile the numbers that the Mediazona is giving. Mediazona has apparently ascertained that Russian losses has tracked 39,000 confirmed Russian combat deaths during the war, and its estimate of likely combat deaths by the Russian military since the start of the war is 47,000. Well, the British Ministry of Defence seems to be trying to reconcile its previous claims with those figures that Mediazona is providing. So it now says that the Russian Ministry of Defence forces likely suffered between 180,000 and 240,000 personnel wounded and approximately 50,000 killed. Now, the number 50,000 is actually quite close to the 47,000 mentioned by Mediazona. But then, of course, the Defense Ministry claims that Wagner forces in Bakhmut likely suffered 40,000 wounded and 20,000 killed. That may be true, but I should say the Mediazona figures appear to include Wagner losses. And then the British Ministry of Defence claims that the Russian side, therefore, has likely suffered around 220 to 280,000 wounded and approximately 70,000 killed. This gives an estimated range of between 290,000 and 350,000 total Russian combat casualties. The median of the estimated range is 320,000 total Russian combatant casualties, which is, of course, again, in line with these figures of 300 plus thousand combat casualties that the Western media, Western governments have been trying to sell to us. Well, I'm not able to talk about numbers of wounded, Russian wounded, but I do remember that quite a long time ago, Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, said that over 90% of Russian soldiers who were wounded were only lightly wounded and were able to return to their units after just a few weeks of recovery and treatment. So this figure of 320,000, if it is remotely true, which it may not be, still gives a misleading picture of what Russian losses are. For the record, and just to reiterate again, media zona figures include Wagner losses, and from what I can understand, they now include losses from volunteer units and from the Donbass militia. They are, in other words, global losses of all Russian forces in fighting in the conflict zone. And Media Zona says that it estimates, its estimate, based on the 39,000 fatalities that it has identified, that its overall estimate of total Russian fatalities over the course of this conflict is around 47,000. I think that is as good as an estimate as you're likely to get, and it is well within the range of what the Russian military at the present time can absorb. Just saying. Anyway, all of that gives us a general sense of the situation on the battlefronts. Not a huge amount of news. I suspect that there have been redeployments by the Russians and maybe logistical issues that they need to overcome. But I also get the sense that weather conditions have not been easy at the moment. But it does seem that the Russians have made some significant advances in the Liman area. And as I said, we've had this rather dramatic report from the Bakhmut area, which I find difficult to understand, and which we will see exactly what it means before long. But anyway, let's move on, because we've had this news now about General Lloyd Austin's visit to Ukraine, and it is somewhat different from what I discussed yesterday. And I am going to go further and say that I think that this visit by Lloyd Austin will come to be seen as the final moment when the United States and Ukraine began their parting of the ways, that after what happened over the course of Lloyd Austin's visit, it is extremely difficult to imagine that the United States will continue to provide support to Ukraine on anything like the scale that it has been doing up to this point. And from this moment onwards, the whole exercise on the part of the United States will be one of damage limitation, in light of what they must now understand is a certain Russian victory. So what happened over the course of Lloyd Austin's visit, and where does the latest information make me revise my account of what I said yesterday? Well, in my account yesterday, I said that Lloyd Austin came to Kiev, made it clear, and this was based on information from Ukrainian telegram channels, resident and legitimate, channels which I believe are at least influenced by and possibly controlled by General Zaluzhny. Anyway, I said that it looked as if General Lloyd Austin had come to Kiev and had made it clear to President Zelensky and his team that the United States at this particular moment in time does not want to see General Zaluzhny sacked. And I suspect that that is still the case. But we are now getting information about what General Zaluzhny and General Austin said to each other. And this information is all over the Ukrainian media now. It's been reported in several places, so clearly somebody is busy leaking this information to the Ukrainian media, and it looks as if this report is true. Now, yesterday I said that over the course of his visit, General Austin had been presented with a Ukrainian demand for 17 million shells. 17 million shells. And I assumed yesterday that that demand must have come from President Zelensky and his civilian advisors. Well, that was wrong. It now seems that the person who communicated this request for 17 million shells to General Austin was none other than General Zaluzhny. When Austin and Zaluzhny met, Zaluzhny told Austin what equipment, what weapons, what funding Ukraine would need in order to achieve the objective that President Zelensky has set, which is the expulsion, the complete expulsion of the Russians from Ukrainian territory and the reconquest by Ukraine, not just of Donbass and Zaporozhye and Kherson region, but of Crimea as well. And Zaluzhny told Austin that in order to achieve that kind of victory, Ukraine now needs 17 million shells and around $350 to $400 billion of material aid, equipment, in the form of equipment. And Austin, hearing all of this, must have been completely incredulous. He must have wondered whether he was dealing with a madman, because as Austin pointed out to Zaluzhny, there simply aren't that many shells, 155 millimeter shells, 17 million of them. There simply aren't that many shells in the world, let alone anywhere near that number to supply specifically to Ukraine. And I'm not an expert in US budgetary matters, and certainly not the US defense budget. But I understand that $400 billion in equipment, which is what Zaluzhny supposedly asked for, is more than double the total amount, annual amount, of the Pentagon's own military equipment budget for defense, for weapon systems and things of that kind. In other words, Zaluzhny was floating to Austin utterly fantastic, ridiculous figures. And one can only assume that Austin came away shaking his head, saying to himself that the Ukrainians have taken leave of their senses, or more probably that they're simply not being serious, or at least that Zaluzhny himself is not being serious. And of course, he then came back to the United States and he made his comments there about the United States quadrupling ammunition production from the level it had reached before the war, and I'm going to come to that shortly. But anyway, he made that comment, and I have to say that he has presumably reported to the president and to the president's team, Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, and possibly the Victoria Nuland and others, the results of this visit, and must have told them that the Ukrainians are now making these fantastic demands. And it's clear that Zaluzhny, at least, in making these demands, has essentially given up, that he doesn't any longer believe that a victory, a long-term victory over the Russians is possible. Now, note that Zaluzhny made this comment at a difficult time in budget terms for the Biden administration. The Biden administration is trying to persuade Congress to authorize $61 billion of financial assistance for Ukraine. The Republicans have become increasingly skeptical. Perhaps the most decisive comments were made by Speaker Mike Johnson. He said that he is far from morally averse to authorizing funding for Ukraine, but he's not sure what all this funding is intended to achieve, that for him it makes little sense to continue funding in this way, that the funding that's been provided in the past has clearly not worked. And before he and the Republicans agree to authorize this funding, they need to have some understanding of what the president's and the administration's plan in Ukraine actually is, because so far they're simply being asked to write a check for $61 billion, and given that all the previous checks that have been provided have basically bounced, what is the point of them now signing off on another one? And of course the Republicans have made their political pitch. They're saying that given how awkward and difficult this whole situation in Ukraine is becoming, what they want is to link funding to Ukraine with funding for protection of the United States' southern border. This is a much more topical and burning issue for Americans, and not unless the White House is prepared to agree to that will they even consider the question of funding for Ukraine. And remarkably, and very tellingly, no less a person than Senator Lindsey Graham, who has up to this time also been a firm advocate of all but unlimited funding for Ukraine, he's now changed his tune, and he's just given a television interview in which he has apparently said that he too will only vote for funding for Ukraine on the basis that the White House also agrees to a package of funding to secure the United States' own border. Now, the last, I suspect, would be politically very difficult for the White House to do, and I doubt actually that they will do it. But of course, we remain to see. But anyway, we see all of these difficult discussions in Congress. We see the skepticism of people like Mike Johnson, which is widely shared amongst Republicans in Congress. And we now have Zaluzhny coming along and telling General Austin, well, you're talking about $61 billion. Actually, What we really need is $400 billion, 7 times more, if we're going to win. And given a demand like that, one can't help but wonder whether people like Mike Johnson and Lindsey Graham, who are presumably going to be briefed at some point about Zaluzhny's demand, are going to turn around and say, well, what is the point then of authorising a further $61 billion if the Ukrainians tell us that they can't achieve victory with that money, that the best perhaps that they can achieve is to prolong the stalemate? We'll come to that in a moment. But ultimately, they can't win. Given that they can't win, surely the better thing to do, difficult as it is to sit down and get the Ukrainians, tell the Ukrainians to begin negotiations with the Russians. So that's one effect, I would have thought, of what General Zaluzhny has done. It may not be widely publicized in the United States, this conversation between Austin and Zaluzhny, but I cannot believe that it won't have serious consequences in terms of future funding for Ukraine when the Americans are confronted with funding requests on this scale and with ammunition requests on this scale. It must make them go away and wonder to themselves whether there is any actual point in investing further in this entire enterprise. Now, that is now going to bring me to this massive article in the Washington Post. And in some ways, as an exercise in historical reconstruction, it is very interesting. First of all, let's start with a discussion that General Zaluzhny apparently had roughly a year ago with General Mark Milley and with General Austin, apparently, in which he discussed then what he needed in order to carry out a successful offensive in Zaporozhye region, the kind of offensive that took place, that the Ukrainians attempted to undertake last summer. And I remember when General Zaluzhny gave his interviews with The Economist in the autumn of last year, he demanded 350 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, and 500 howitzers. So 500 howitzers. And I remember thinking at the time that these were absurd numbers, that they were far beyond what the Western powers could realistically be expected to provide. And apparently, Zaluzhny told the Americans that he needed 9 fresh brigades to conduct this offensive successfully. Now, we're told that the Americans gasped at these requests. This is in the Washington Post article, that they did indeed find the demands every bit as extreme as I thought they were at the time when Zaluzhny was first reported making them in that interview with The Economist. But perhaps to Zaluzhny's astonishment, the Americans then decided that they would fulfill all of Zaluzhny's demands. And the Washington Post goes into some detail about how the Americans strong-armed their European allies to get the European allies to join with the Americans to provide the Ukrainians with the infantry fighting vehicles, the artillery, the tanks that Zaluzhny was asking for. The 9 brigades that he wanted were indeed all created. Training was provided and all of that was done. And the Americans also committed to providing the Ukrainians with the shells that Ukraine would need to conduct this successful offensive. And the Americans found that they were short of shells, that the Ukrainians would need around 90,000 shells a month. It turns out that at the start of last year, US production of 155 millimeter shells was around a tenth of that. Now, note, a tenth of 90,000 is 9,000 shells a month. We've been given different figures for American shell production. At one time, I remember reading that the US was producing 14,000 shells a month prior to the start of the current conflict in February 2022. Then I read somewhere else a few weeks ago that the actual number was 12,000 shells a month before the start of the conflict in February 2022. The Washington Post has now indirectly said, and I suspect that this is the correct figure, that US shell production in early 2023 was 9,000 shells a month. 9,000. So the base point for US shell production is lower than we had been led to believe. It wasn't 14,000. It was 9,000 a month. And it's clear that throughout 2023, the United States was finding it incredibly difficult to increase that output further. And the European Union was running into the same problems. And when it became clear that the United States and the European Union would not be able to supply Ukraine with the shells it needed for the offensive, the United States did exactly that which I have repeatedly said in various programs that it would do. I've encountered some skepticism about this, but this is what the Washington Post has now confirmed. They went to the South Koreans and they borrowed hundreds of thousands of shells from South Korea, perhaps not 500,000, perhaps more like 350,000. And these South Korean shells were, again, according to the Washington Post, delivered directly to Ukraine, and they were the shells with which Ukraine was expected to conduct its offensive. Now, what then happened was that the Americans got together, they did all their various simulations, exercises, their various tabletop exercises throughout the winter and the spring. They planned and prepared for this offensive. They did so in meticulous detail. They decided that with all the equipment that they were providing, with all the brigades that they were providing, equipment and brigades that Zaluzhny had asked for, with all the shells, they would be able to break through the Russian defenses. And it's clear again, when you read the Washington Post article, that the US military had an utterly contemptuous view of the Russian military, that their understanding of the Russian military was profoundly flawed. They assumed that the Russian military was corrupt, inefficient, badly run, demoralized, that it was racked by internal factional problems, that it had suffered huge casualties. Again, the clear operating assumption that the Americans appear to have had as they planned this offensive is that they were going to launch an offensive get the Ukrainians to launch an offensive with all this fancy kit and new training and all these shells against a corrupt, demoralized, enfeebled opponent, an enemy rather like the one they encountered in Iraq in the two wars in 1991 and 2003 that they fought against Iraq. And they seem to have imagined that it would be essentially a repeat of all of that. And with all those assumptions built into the tabletop exercises and the simulations and the war planning and the war games and all of that, it's perhaps unsurprising that they calculated that Rabotino would be captured in 2 days and that the entire offensive would be wrapped up in around 90 days. Now, I'm going to suggest that my original assumption of last year, that when Zaluzhny came forward and said that he needed 9 brigades, 350 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, and 500 howitzers in order to conduct a successful offensive, that my initial view at the time was that Zaluzhny was making what he believed were impossible demands. My memory, by the way, of the interview with The Economist is that it was very downbeat, that Zaluzhny was very downbeat in his assessments of the war. But anyway, I now think that that is exactly what Zaluzhny was doing. He was trying, far from emboldening the Americans to launch further offensives, he was trying to get the Americans, on the contrary, to understand that what was being asked of Ukraine, the achievement of a military victory, a clear-cut military victory over the Russians, was impossible. What then happened was that the Americans took Zaluzhny for his word, to his own horror and astonishment. And I suspect that his own mysterious disappearance, Zaluzhny's mysterious disappearance through the late spring, as the offensive drew closer, the date for the offensive drew closer, that Zaluzhny's disappearance was because he knew that all of the assumptions upon which the Americans were working were simply wrong, but having been given all the equipment and all the brigades that he was asking for, he didn't have the courage to say as much and to expose his own lack of belief in what he was doing. Anyway, it then becomes clear that there were disagreements and disputes between the Americans and the Ukrainians from a pretty early stage. The Americans, again, focused on their offensive, wanting to break through to the Sea of Azov, to the Black Sea, a plan which I suspect, by the way, had been floating around for many more months than this Washington Post article tells us. That the Americans, full of optimism and confidence, and it's clear, by the way, that one of the most confident and optimistic people was none other than General Milley. He was carefully hedging by telling people that this would be a difficult and challenging offensive to make, but in private he seems to have been full of confidence and optimism about the prospects of this offensive. Anyway, what the Americans found was that the Ukrainians, well, Zaluzhny basically went absent without leave. The Washington Post article doesn't tell us much about this, but he clearly did. The Ukrainians searched around repeatedly for excuses to delay the offensive, which they obviously knew in advance, was based on a whole set of wrong assumptions. And the Ukrainians also continued the battle of Bakhmut. And here, by the way, I think that the Ukrainians have a much better understanding of the war than the Americans do. They have repeatedly told the Americans, apparently even Zaluzhny has been telling the Americans, that Bakhmut matters, that if Ukraine finally and conclusively loses this battle in Bakhmut, then the entire central front that Ukraine has, the fronts in Donbass, will collapse and that the Russians will win the war. This is a message that the Americans have been unwilling to hear, focused as they were on this idea of this great offensive towards the Black Sea in the south. Anyway, eventually the offensive, as we all know, was launched weeks after the Americans wanted it to be launched. The Americans are very angry and bitter about this. They're complaining furiously about the fact that these delays that the Ukrainians made meant that the Russians were able to build up their fortifications even more. But anyway, when the offensive was finally launched, it fell apart almost immediately. All the assumptions, all the calculations, all the plans that the Americans had drawn up turned out to be fundamentally flawed and wrong. And the Americans began to criticize the Ukrainians for not sticking to the plan, not for failing to stick with the new combined arms tactics that they'd been taught. But frankly, looking at the realities, understanding what actually happened, it's difficult to see how any plan, any tactics could have succeeded against the Russian forces and the Russian defenses that were actually there on the battlefronts. And the result is that the offensive has failed, and the Americans now coming back and asking Zaluzhny, no doubt, similar questions to the ones that they asked him last year. What do you need in order to win? Well, Zaluzhny this time has understood things better than he did last year. He understands that pitching his demands at what seems like a rational level, but at a very high one, in the expectation that the Americans might balk at it, doesn't work. So this time he's done something else completely. He's pitched it at a purely and completely fantastic level in order to make even the Americans finally understand that what they are demanding of Ukraine is impossible. So there we are. We see the underlying truth about this war. The Americans have tried to micromanage it. They've not really been listening to what the Ukrainian commanders, people like Zaluzhny, have been trying to tell them. They've been misreading Zaluzhny's signals. They've been going all out ever since the conflict began to achieve some great decisive victory over the Russians. They've been building into their planning lots of assumptions about the weakness, corruption, incompetence, mismanagement of the Russian military in order to make their plans appear viable. And when it comes to Ukraine, they've not taken no for an answer. Professor Mearsheimer has talked at huge length, great length, and with great erudition, and if I may say so, with great courage. He's come in for all kinds of criticisms for doing this, about how the repeated promises that were made to Ukraine leading up to this conflict basically set Ukraine on the primrose path towards the situation in which it finds itself in now. Well, the Americans continue to do the same thing. It is now clear. After the conflict first began, they continued to hold a wildly over-optimistic idea of what the Ukrainians could do. They were pushing the Ukrainians relentlessly into launching massive offensives. They were aiming at nothing less than a victory over the Russians. The Russian military, one of the most storied militaries in the world, with an extraordinary history behind it, and the military, by the way, of a country that was once and may one day soon become again a superpower. They thought that they could do all of that, and they did that pushing aside all doubts, all skepticism, and have propelled Ukraine further on the path towards its own destruction. And by the way, it's clear that there were voices of doubt. William Burns, often described by many people as the one rational person left in the American government, might be interesting to people who are watching this program to see what Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson said about William Burns in the program that he did with us on the Duran, with Glenn Deason and myself. Anyway, it turns out that the one person who is expressing doubts about the viability of the whole offensive plan was none other than William Burns. But of course, nobody wanted to listen to him. In fact, we learned that the military, all out for going on this offensive, were becoming irritated by the pessimistic assessments they were getting from Burns and from the CIA. So there we go. So what happens now? Well, Ukraine has now been put in a terrible position. Already on the eve of that offensive last year, when the Americans were pushing the Ukrainians towards that offensive, Ukrainian losses, it turns out, were extremely high. The Washington Post tells us how high they were, or at least how high the Americans estimated that they were. But it turns out that over the course of the fighting in 2022, during the Russian spring offensive and the spring and summer offensive, and then during the Ukrainian counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region in the autumn, the best troops and the best officers, many of the best troops and officers of the Ukrainian military, had already been killed or wounded beyond recall to the battlefronts. So already the Ukrainian military in the early part of 2023 was in a poor state. And it now seems that it's in a much worse state now. Ukrainian losses over the course of the summer offensive have been enormous. Ukrainian equipment losses have been enormous. It seems that the Ukrainians have given up demanding or requesting more tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Probably they fear that if they do make these requests, they'll be pushed into undertaking more offensives again. So the Ukrainians, very much against their the inclinations of their political leadership, are now being forced gradually to accept that they're going to have to go onto the defensive. that has created huge political tension within Ukraine itself, between General Zaluzhny, who clearly does want to transition entirely onto the defensive, and President Zelensky, who has staked his political reputation on Ukraine achieving complete victory on the battlefronts. And we now have the unresolved crisis in Kiev that I've been talking about over the course of my recent programs. So there it is. The Russians now, they have the wind in their sails. Their military is reorganized and rearmed. They're pushing steadily in all directions. Jim Webb and George Beebe, back in the summer, in August, even as the offensive was falling apart, were advising that Ukraine go on to the defensive then. It's been left desperately late for Ukraine to do that. Now, Zelensky talked about creating fortified lines. I'm going to say straight away that I've not seen any evidence so far that the Ukrainians are seriously building fortified lines that can in any way compare with the fortified lines that the Russians constructed at record speed and with incredible density and levels of sophistication in the autumn and winter and spring of last year and of the beginning of this year. So with the Russians now also cranking up their political demands, making it clear that they have political demands of a type that Ukraine might find it extremely difficult to accept. Anyway, with all of that going on, the situation of Ukraine has been maneuvered into is now all but catastrophic. Before I move on to discuss briefly the situation in Gaza and to discuss developments there, wrapping up on Ukraine, just a few further things. I'm not absolutely certain about the timing of this, but I understand, from what I can tell, Seymour Hersh's article about the direct contacts between Zaluzhny and Gerasimov, the overall Russian commander and chief of general staff, that those contacts, that article by Seymour Hersh appeared shortly after Lloyd Austin returned to the United States. And I wonder whether perhaps, just possibly, this is just a possibility, one of the purposes of this article by Seymour Hersh might have been to try to prompt Zaluzhny to do exactly that which he is supposed to be already doing with, as discussed in Seymour Hersh's article, that is to say, to reach out to Gerasimov and to see whether or not the two military leaders can reach some kind of understanding with each other. As I said, I am confident that nothing like that is actually at the moment taking place. The Russian media did briefly report this conversation between Gerasimov and Zaluzhny, but this article that did briefly report this article by Hersh about these discussions between Gerasimov and Zaluzhny. But clearly an instruction has been sent from the Kremlin to remove all references, excise all references to this purported discussion from the Russian media, and a brief report that appeared about it on TASS, on the TASS news agency, has now disappeared. So I'm confident that no such discussion is indeed actually taking place, but perhaps the Americans want Zaluzhny to do this thing, and that is what they were signaling he should do, through this article. Who's to say? Anyway, one thing I would quickly say is that I very much doubt that Zaluzhny any longer has the political credibility in Kiev to get this agreement, if he ever were to forge an agreement with Gerasimov, to get it through the political leadership in Kiev. And if he really were to reach out to Gerasimov in the way that Seymour Hersh is suggesting, it's difficult to imagine that Zelensky and his team would not see that as the first step by Zaluzhny towards mounting a coup. So whether the authors, the true authors of that article, understand that, I'm not fully sure. We'll just have to wait and see. I noticed that Stephen Bryan at Asia Times is as skeptical. Well, he also expresses skepticism about this whole Gerasimov-Zaluzhny conversation. And so does Gilbert Doctorow, both of whom are people who have an extensive knowledge of Russian matters. And anyway, I've made my own opinion about the complete falsity of that article already clear, the falsity of the information, I should say, upon which that article is based. So that's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is just briefly returning to the topic of the fortified lines that the Ukrainians are supposed now to be in the process of creating. Well, the Russians, one of the reasons, of course, that the Russians were able to create fortified lines at such record speed is because they have massive amounts of construction equipment, they have huge amounts of cement and stones and bricks and all of the things that, and wire, and all of the things that you would need to create elaborate fortifications. They have the earth-moving equipment that would be needed to dig deep trenches and barriers through the earth in midwinter. And of course, they also had the security of being able to build these fortified lines in the knowledge that they would not run into any interference from the Ukrainian Air Force, because the Ukrainian Air Force is in no condition to seriously interfere with this type of work. None of that, it seems to me, applies to Ukraine. President Zelensky suggested that much of the work to build fortified lines would have to be given out to private contractors, which in Ukraine is probably going to lead to further embezzlement of funds. That's been the history in Ukraine up to now. I doubt that Ukraine has the stocks of building materials and the engineering forces and the earth-moving equipment in anything like the quantities that would be needed to create fortified lines quickly, comparable to those that the Russians created, especially in midwinter when the ground is hard. And beyond that, of course, now Ukraine would be faced with heavy interference by the Russian Air Force. The Russians have built up huge stocks of missiles, which they could deploy against any workers trying to build these fortified lines. And they also are now operating regularly with precision-guided bombs. Yuri Ignat, the Ukrainian Air Force's spokesman says that the Russians are now dropping around 100 heavy bombs a day, still an insignificant number compared to what Israel is dropping, for example, in Gaza. But nonetheless, that number is increasing all the time, and the bombs are gradually becoming heavier and more precise as well. So this construction of these big fortified lines might have been possible if it had been done in the winter and spring of this year, perhaps even in the summer when Jim Webb and George Beeb's article appeared. But I think it's going to be very difficult to do now. And in order to do it, Ukraine would need an enormous amount of technical and industrial support from the West. Now, the means to do that in the West obviously exists, but I wonder whether, after all that has happened, Western governments and Western electorates will want to authorize the large sums of money and the diversion of construction equipment and air defense systems needed to protect the builders, when it's been all but accepted, acknowledged, that the war in Ukraine is in the process now of being lost. What would be the point of doing that? And again, and for the record, even if fortified lines were indeed built up, I suspect that the Russians would be able to break them. There is a section in the Washington Post article which claims that the Russians have encountered some of the same problems in Avdeyevka that the Ukrainians encountered in their offensive, that the Russians have also found that it's difficult to conduct advances in the face of minefields and fortifications. This ignores the fact that the Russians have in fact been making significant progress around Avdeyevka, and that Avdeyevka is now likely, perhaps even certain, to fall at some point soon, whereas the Ukrainians never managed to dent the Russian fortifications in any place. So, a bleak picture for Ukraine. I have said previously that given the chaos in Kiev, I can't imagine that negotiations are really a possibility there, despite Ukrainian public opinion moving in favor of negotiations. I do question whether the Russians would be willing to negotiate with Ukraine for anything short of total capitulation. The source I discussed yesterday told me that that is now the Russian demand. So, anyway, we shall see what happens. But a bleak picture overall for Ukraine, and we see how bad political decisions in the West and bad military decisions also have led Ukraine to this point, and how all the indications now are that the US government, that the United States, faced by a situation where there is no prospect of victory, is going to start looking for ways to walk away. That essentially is what Speaker Mike Johnson is saying. That's the conclusion, it seems, that even Senator Lindsey Graham has come to. I suspect that the White House wants some additional funding to Ukraine simply in order to prevent a collapse taking place during the election year. But we saw in that article by Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times yesterday that people in the Democratic Party are already worrying that come the election next year, the word will be that Joe Biden is the man who lost Ukraine. And we can see how that came about. Anyway, let me now turn again to the topic of Gaza. And one of the things I neglected to mention about Gideon Rachman's article yesterday is that with all of these aircraft carriers and missile submarines now positioned in the Middle East, but unable apparently to launch strikes against Iran because the opposition from the Arab and Muslim world is too great, and the opposition in the United States from the Democratic Party's electorate is too great also. With all of that, the administration is now becoming concerned that this huge fleet that they've deployed in the Middle East is tied down in the Middle East, and that means that these two aircraft carriers and all their accompanying destroyers and all the other warships and that Ohio submarine are no longer capable of being redeployed quickly to the Pacific region. And there are now clear signs that the incumbent government in Taiwan is going to be re-elected. Apparently the current president will not be, but her likely successor is somebody who has an even stronger pro-independence bias than she does. So it is plausible that political tensions between the United States and China are going to intensify again over the next few weeks and months. And instead of having its fleet concentrated on, as they would say, deterring China, there are people in the administration who are now worrying that a significant part of it is locked up, tied down in the Middle East, intimidating or deterring Iran. Anyway, the fighting in Gaza has resumed, and the bombing has resumed, and the deaths and destruction there has resumed. There's recriminations, arguments as to who is responsible for all of this. But the fact, ultimately, the actual detail, in a true sense, no longer matters. It may be the case, for example, as the US administration is claiming, that the reason the ceasefire broke down was because Hamas did not release all the female hostages that it was expected to release. Who's to say? But for most of the world, this no longer matters anymore. What they see is the war being carried out in Gaza, the deaths of civilians there, many of them children. They see the destruction of buildings. They see the cutting off of the internet. They see the resumption of the blockade of Gaza, and diplomatic activity is now intensifying once more. The Russians have confirmed that the Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, is about to visit Moscow, where he's going to have high-level discussions with the Russians. And probably the Russians will want to discuss the situation in the Middle East. First and foremost, they will undoubtedly also discuss the major delivery of Air Force systems by Russia to Iran. The Iranians have now confirmed that they're receiving Sukhoi 35 fighter jets from Russia, far more advanced than any fighter jets Iran has in its arsenal up to this time, and comparable to the best fighter jets that you will find in the Middle East, apart possibly from the F-35s that Israel has. And the Russians are also supplying Iran with Yak 130 jet trainers, which are also, by the way, formidable ground attack aircraft if used in that manner, and importantly, Mi-28 helicopter gunships, which are roughly analogous to the American Apaches. So these are all coming to Iran. The Russians obviously now have strong industrial and military industrial links with Iran, so they will no doubt be talking about that. The Iranians will want to talk about oil, cooperation in oil industry issues. There's just been another OPEC Plus production cut. Politico has now written another article about the failure of the oil price cap on Russian exports. Anyway, the Russians will be talking all about that. With Ebrahim Raisi, Raisi will want to talk about the situation in Ukraine, but above all, they will be talking about the situation in Gaza and the next moves that will be taken over the next few days and weeks, probably in the United Nations, in the Security Council and the General Assembly, to advance the process of brokering a ceasefire. So, having a ceasefire resolution pass either through the Security Council or the General Assembly. And following Raisi's visit to Moscow, we now have confirmation that Putin himself is flying to Saudi Arabia, where he will be meeting with King Salman himself and also with Saudi Arabia's Prime Minister and Crown Prince MBS. So we could see that the diplomatic activity is intensifying once more. And the Americans will no doubt be extremely irritated that Putin is apparently being received in Saudi Arabia. Bear in mind that though Secretary Blinken has visited Saudi Arabia several times and was once stood up for a whole night by MBS, who condescended to meet him finally only the following morning, President Biden himself has not been able to visit Saudi Arabia over the period of this current conflict in Gaza. So all of these things are now taking place in the Middle East, and frustrations by the Americans, but more diplomatic moves coming shortly. The Russians working with both Iran and with Saudi Arabia, the Chinese hovering in the background, and tensions between the United States and China likely to intensify before long over the topic of Taiwan. Altogether, just as Gideon Rachman was reporting those US officials telling him in his article, which appeared yesterday in the Financial Times, this looks like a disastrous situation, and the United States is on the defensive in every place. Ukraine is going down fast. The situation in the Middle East is out of control. Much of the American fleet is now tied up there. The situation in the Pacific is deteriorating, and the Russians are making big diplomatic moves with the Saudis and with Iran. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop and look at the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoods, our hoodies, our t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.